Welcome back, scholars, to Lesson 5-2.4, The Ming and the West. Today's lesson is going to be reviewing some of the Ming Dynasty and what made it different from the Yuans, and also introduce the root of some future conflicts and why the Chinese do so poorly in those conflicts. So, let's get to it. The Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty was the dynasty that seized control of China from the Yuan Dynasty. Remember, those were the Mongols. Now, during the Yuan Dynasty, China had been the wealthiest empire on earth, and this is on the back of all that trade that the Mongols encouraged. So the Yuan Dynasty was very wealthy. The Ming Dynasty takes it over. They're pretty wealthy too. Now, let's look at some important differences between the Yuan and the Ming, however. The Yuan had been big promoters of individual freedom of religion, and a few other freedoms out there. They also supported international trade. They wanted to have as much contact with the world as possible, incorporate as many foreign ideas as they could into their empire. If it was good for somebody else, it might be good for them, so why not give it a try? And they also devolved power down to others. That is, they did not have to rule with this absolute authority. In fact, they couldn't, because they were an extreme minority in a Chinese country. They had to share some power. The Ming, by contrast, wanted a very strict Chinese culture. They did not want that foreign influence, and so they limited foreign contact to some pretty impressive extremes, like Chinese not being allowed to leave the country. Additionally, they centralized power. They believed that all power should be held by the emperor and flow through him, and so they did that. So we have some important contrasts between these Yuan and the Ming. Now, a defining moment for the Ming Dynasty, and which really shifts us from the early Ming to the middle and later Ming Dynasty, is this burning of Zhang He's treasure fleet. Remember that it might have just rotted in the ports, but burning is such a cooler way to look at it. The burning of Zhang He's treasure fleet was this defining moment in the Ming Dynasty, because they're no longer going to be focused on external affairs. They are now an isolationist nation. That is, they are really only focused on what's going on internally and controlling their own population. Now, the costs of isolationism. Isolationism has its benefits, also has its drawbacks. When the Ming Dynasty chooses to isolate China, they lose contact with other nations. So they're not in this regular interaction with other nations, other powers, finding out what's happening in the world. All that kind of drops away. And in an important way, military technology, the Middle East and Europe are going to surpass the Chinese. And it doesn't take them too long to do that. The Chinese go from being one of the most advanced militarily to really being behind these other powers. And if militarily you are behind other powers, then those other people can use that to their advantage. And boy, do the Europeans ever do that. It starts with the Portuguese. The Portuguese are going to show up in China in the early 1500s, about 50 years after Zhang He did his treasure fleet voyages. And they show up in these ships that are substantially smaller than some of the Chinese ships, but technologically they are far more advanced. They navigate better, they can turn themselves, steer themselves in tactical battle better, and they're better armed. The European cannon had far surpassed the Chinese cannon at this time. So these ships and weapons of war, the Chinese have nothing that can compare with them. These ships can just rip apart anything China tries to put in the water. And keep in mind, China outlawed building ships for foreign trade a long time back. Their navy is not manned with a lot of experienced people. The Portuguese, sitting, if you're not sure geographically where Portugal is, it is way out on the edge of Europe, sticking out into the Atlantic Ocean. These people have been living on ships for quite a while because that's how they trade. That's how they live. They're fishermen and merchants out in Portugal at this time. The Chinese then are put in a position where they have to give some concessions to Portugal. For example, they allow the Portuguese to rent the city of Macau. I mentioned this once before, the city on a peninsula, and it allows the Portuguese to have a base for trade with China. Without these cannon, without these ships, Portugal probably would not have been allowed to do that. Well, with the Portuguese start, the British really run away with. Centuries later, so I'm jumping out of the Middle Ages with this. This is outside of the scope of our class, but I do want to let you know what's coming for China as a result of their isolationism, largely as a result of the isolationism. And that's that the British are going to be able to just have their way with China, and they will shatter Chinese isolationism. China is simply not allowed to be isolationist once the British come through. Advanced British ships are going to force China to accept foreign trade. There's a series of wars called the Opium Wars. Opium, if you're not aware, is a narcotic. It's a drug, highly addictive. And the British wanted to sell opium to the Chinese, and the Chinese said no. So the British sent in their navy and their army and beat up the Chinese and said, all right, now will you let us sell opium to you? And the Chinese really didn't have a choice anymore. There were a series of wars where the British did this. They became the biggest drug dealers in Asia, and the Chinese were forced to allow the British to do so. Once reopened to global trade, however, once China becomes engaged in global trade, the Chinese economy is going to change, and it's going to be slow for a while, but we are talking about a nation today that is not isolationist. They are the leading export nation in the world in many categories, and in terms of overall global trade, China's a monster. I mean, just look at all the articles of clothing or other items around you that say made in China. Go ahead and take a look. You will see made in China everywhere because China is very much engaged in global trade today. That's partially as a result of this forced reopening. But do keep in mind throughout the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages in particular, under the Ming Dynasty, that's not what China wanted. That's all for this time, and in fact, that is all for this course on the Middle Ages. This will be the last lesson that I am uploading directly to this, particularly for our Blackstone Valley Prep scholars. Good luck with things going forward. I do miss you. I will continue to miss you. And I wish you all the best of luck in your third trimester.